When my home burned down, my parents lied about helping me while letting my brother live rent-free in their guest house. I'm Miles, 29 then, the older brother who kept our family calendar neat and our conversations polite. The one who learned early that calm voices can cut sharper than shouting. That Wednesday was fine until the socket behind my fridge coughed smoke like it hated groceries, and an orange tongue rolled across the cabinets before my brain caught up with the alarm's stuttering scream. I grabbed my gym bag, jammed my wallet and phone inside with shaking hands, and sprinted while heat chased me down the stairs. 2 other units were hit before the firefighters drowned it. I stood on the curb, blinking at a window that had been mine an hour earlier, breathing burned carpet and wet ash. No one was hurt, but my place was dead, and I kept patting my pockets like something might appear if I looked polite enough. Reflex steered me to Mom first. Deirdre answered with a voice that felt like a smile drawn on glass. She listened to the mess in clipped paragraphs, then hummed about life, giving holy nudges toward new roads, maybe somewhere calmer. I asked about the casita behind their place, that tidy stucco box with the green door and the deep shade. She drifted into apologies about renovations, contractors, and how they couldn't handle disruptions. She suggested a cheap motel for a week while I let the universe take the wheel. I called Warren next. He sighed like patience was leaking out of him, said things were complicated, and hung up before I could translate. Nolan from my rec league answered on the first try and told me to bring whatever wasn't already smoke. Bree, his girlfriend, smiled like she'd stapled it on, and I promised to be invisible. 3 nights I learned to sleep with one ear on their whispers and the other on the world's quietest microwave. Between apartment searches and the kind of budgeting that turns nickels into Sudoku, I scrolled social. And that's when Jude's story slipped the punch I should have seen coming. There was the pool I grew up cleaning, the dumb flamingo float Mom refused to toss, and then the pan that landed on the casita porch, his hoodie draped across the rail. He posted again from inside. Even the ugly curtains couldn't hide the lamp glow. I sent a message. He left it unread. I called Warren with the screenshot still open. He muttered about Jude needing support while adulthood warmed up in the bullpen. I asked why renovation looked like Jude's shoes by the door. He said the casita wasn't my business and hung up again. Motel links and emoji blessings came from Mom, sweet on the surface and hollow underneath. 2 mornings later, I was sleeping in my hatchback behind the gym because Bree's size had started carrying small knives. By Friday, Deirdre invited me to Sunday supper with a line about family unity. I said yes, wanting answers more than peace. My last good shirt still smelled like smoke despite laundromat cycles. Jude shuffled in wearing slides and a grin that suggested naps were a profession. Mom set out the roast while talking about sermons. Warren kept chewing like winning depended on it. I asked how long Jude planned to stay in the casita. Deirdre slid the talk to weather. I asked again. Jude shrugged, eyes on his phone. My plate cooled while Deirdre folded her hands and said life drops lessons through fire or flood to get restless boys to pay attention. I asked if she thought a fire was my teacher. She looked straight at me and said maybe the flames had found the wrong target. Warren chuckled, then announced love for me had gone quiet when I was 12. Jude glanced up once, then back to his phone. The room felt smaller than any apartment I'd toured. I pushed my chair back slowly and told them fairness worked both ways. Deirdre pretended not to hear. Warren rotated his wrist like time owed him favors. I walked out through the side door into rosemary and chlorine. The gate latch was warm in my hand, and for a second I felt 12 again, the age someone decided I'd expired. I drove with the windows down because hot wind beat stale silence, and the lights ahead built a spine I promised myself I would climb, no matter the burn. Back at the gym lot, I leaned my seat flat, opened my notes app, and wrote 3 lines. I will not beg, I will not sign, I will not forget. The sprinklers coughed to life while a train mumbled somewhere beyond a billboard, and I timed my breathing to that faraway thunder until sleep arrived like a stray dog that trusted me enough to curl beside me. Morning comes quick when nowhere is yours. The sun threw gold across the dash, and I decided my story wouldn't end at a table where my name was retired. The days after that dinner stretched like stubborn rubber bands that refused to snap, and I learned how to move inside them without making extra noise that might bother people already committed to pretending I did not exist. I woke before sunrise to shower at the gym while the treadmills clicked under buzzing lights. then dried off with a towel that still smelled faintly of smoke and detergent, which felt like both a reminder and a warning. Nolan handed me a spare key because he is good in ways that never beg for applause, although Bree arranged the throw pillows with the urgency of someone tidying a feeling she could not name. I promised every morning that I was almost out, almost stable, almost a man with a door that locked from the inside. And every night I repeated it to a ceiling fan that blinked without pity. My hatchback became a spare room when Bree's patience thinned to sewing thread, and I mapped which church lots were ignored by security and which counters quietly refilled a cup if you acted like you belonged. With my phone at 20% and my brain at 15, I began tracing my parents' digital footprints like a bored detective with no badge, because the gap between what they said and what they posted had always been the size of a living room. Deirdre filled her page with pastel squares about surrender and simplicity, while Warren listed his watches in a marketplace he once mocked. One clip caught a slice of patio I knew too well, the string lights glowing against the stucco, and there in the background sat the casita's green door cracked open. The next upload sealed it, a backyard with new cushions and a caption about blessings, and just inside the frame lay Jude's slides abandoned like a signature. I typed, "Looks great for a renovation," felt the old teenage adrenaline, and right on cue the comment vanished. Rochelle called with the voice of someone who smokes only when furious, and she said Deirdre had been whispering about burdens and difficult sons. She asked if anyone had approached me about signing documents from our grandmother's will, which pressed at my temples. Grandma, who kept gum in her purse and receipts in a locked tin, left a set amount for both grandkids with release at 33. Rochelle told me not to sign anything no matter how kindly it was folded. I thanked her for being the only adult who treated me like I wasn't auditioning for the role of disappointment, then saved her number as a star. I tried Jude again out of habit, asking if rent existed in his arrangement, and he replied with a sticker of a cartoon king asleep on coins. I drove past our parents' street at dusk, parking a block away, and walked past slowly enough to hear the casita's speaker bleeding bass in a hot air. Laughter spilled out between tracks, young and careless. I kept moving because I wasn't there to perform heartbreak for a Ring camera, and I let the sidewalk return me to the car that smelled like Jim's soap and instant noodles. At the grocery store, Tessa bumped her cart into mine and asked for news. She'd heard Deirdre complaining that the casita should be paying the mortgage, not sheltering a grown child avoiding rent through strategic helplessness. She promised to tell me if she heard numbers. I left with discount bread and a Focus that made the parking lot brighter. I met Rochelle at her table while her dog snored, and she slid a photocopy of the will across the wood. The language was plain. The adults guarding the funds owed accounting to the beneficiaries. She gave me a template letter even a stubborn father couldn't misunderstand, underlining that missed deadlines have consequences. Back in the hatchback, I gathered evidence. Screenshots of captions with shoes on the step, Warren's listings with timestamps, Jude's sticker. Each bit felt like sweeping glass into a jar to save feet later. Nolan asked if I was all right. I told him I was calmer than I looked. Bree left a folded blanket with a note about cold mornings. I started running again, picturing the green door with every mile. When the envelope went out with my neatest signature, I felt still. I texted Tessa the basics, told Rochelle I'd keep pouring water if the response was smoke. Deirdre sent messages about storms and unity. Warren stayed silent. I began telling the truth in circles that wouldn't turn it into theater. Yes, I slept in my car sometimes, and no, I wasn't embarrassed enough to stop insisting on the math grandma wrote in ink. Some dropped off casseroles like I was bereaved. The point shifted from survival to clarity. I returned to that block at sunset, watching Jude cross the yard with a takeout bag and a laugh from childhood. I didn't hate him, but I didn't wave either. That night, I practiced what I'd say if someone finally answered. Asked for numbers, then dates, then signatures. Sleep came late, but steady, a dog in the next car dreaming me less alone. By week's end, I owned a cheap folder with tabs that made me look professional enough to scare the right people, and I had a list of cousins who understood the outline. I muted Deirdre's feed, muted Warren's silence. I saved the final demand in 3 places and walked it to the post office, where the clerk stamped it with a thud like a small gavel blessing a larger one. Stepping back into the glare, I knew which mile marker would finally make somebody else slow down. I walked into that barbecue like someone stepping into a room wired for noise, pretending my pulse was steady when it was actually tapping out a faster rhythm behind my ribs. Rochelle had promised she would keep the peace, but I knew that peace in my family was often a temporary performance for whichever cousin had the most sympathetic face at the moment. The smell of grilled meat wrapped around me like a blanket that could turn suffocating if I stayed in one spot for too long, and the laughter in the yard felt thinner than usual, like everyone knew there was a line running under our feet that could snap. My mother, Deirdre, gave me that tight smile she uses when she wants to look like the kind of mother people praise on Facebook, while my father, Warren, just nodded and moved toward the beer cooler as if avoiding direct eye contact would erase me from the guest list entirely. The questions came quickly, dropped between bites of potato salad and gulps of soda, from cousins and aunts who claimed they had only heard bits and pieces about my situation. I knew Rochelle had been filling in blanks, but she did it in her way, softened edges, heavy on resilience, light on betrayal. I gave them short answers, careful enough not to fuel a family-wide drama fire, but honest enough that their expressions shifted from polite interest to something closer to unease. That's when Deirdre cornered me by the drinks table, her voice low and sharp as she asked if I had come to my senses about the inheritance. She said it like it was a moral test I had been failing on purpose, not a matter of my parents hiding money they were legally holding in trust for me. When I told her to just say what she wanted without the riddles, she dropped the pretense. She wanted me to sign over my share so they could handle it properly and secure the family's future. The way she said family made it clear she meant herself and Warren, maybe Jude if it suited them, but definitely not me. Warren appeared at her shoulder like a shadow and delivered his usual calm-voiced cruelty, reminding me there had always been a plan for the guest house, and they couldn't give handouts to everyone. I asked if that was why Jude got it rent-free while I was sleeping in my car. He didn't flinch when he said, "Peter, no, Jude, needed support right now." I told him I had needed support when my apartment burned down and they had given me nothing. He just shrugged and said life wasn't fair. Rochelle stepped in before my voice rose, telling them to back off, but I could already feel eyes on us from across the yard. My mother's jaw tightened, my father's hands curled into fists at his sides, and I realized they didn't just want my signature. They wanted my silence, my complicity, and my agreement to disappear from the conversation entirely. They left early, Deirdre slamming the car door hard enough that the sound lingered. Over the next week, the tension didn't simmer, it spiked. My mother sent me long, twisting messages about family unity and sacrifice, trying to dress guilt up as wisdom, while Warren called twice just to accuse me of disrespecting the family name. I ignored them both, but I started hearing from other relatives. Tessa said people were asking if it was true my parents had lied about the casita. Another cousin told me someone had found out about my nights sleeping in the hatchback and thought it was a shame, like I was some side character in a cautionary tale. I decided to turn the whispers into something sharper. I began telling the full story, stripped of drama, delivered as facts that couldn't be twisted without obvious lies. I explained the fire, the lie about renovations, the casita, and the inheritance. Most reactions landed somewhere between shock and quiet agreement, though a few warned me that pushing harder might destroy what little relationship I still had with my parents. I told them that relationship had already been burned to the ground. My parents had just kept the ashes neatly swept to one side. The crack in their perfect image widened fast. Deirdre tried to organize a family dinner for healing, and barely anyone showed up. Warren started snapping at Jude for leaving dirty dishes in the casita sink, which was the first time I'd heard of him holding my brother accountable for anything. Jude texted me that it was my fault things were tense, to which I replied simply, "Welcome to my world." But I didn't stop there. I began looking into exactly how to force a legal accounting of Grandma's will. And the more I read, the more I realized how much leverage I actually had. Rochelle promised to help quietly. She started forwarding me messages my mother had sent her, little passive-aggressive digs about disloyalty and betrayal that sounded less like wisdom and more like panic. One night, as I was reviewing paperwork in the back of my hatchback, I noticed a shadow outside. It was Jude, standing in the parking lot of the grocery store where I sometimes parked overnight. He didn't knock, didn't speak, just stared for a moment before walking away. I don't know if he'd been sent to intimidate me or if curiosity had just pulled him there, but the sight of him watching me like that set something in my chest on edge. The next day, Warren showed up at Nolan's place. He didn't come inside, just stood on the porch long enough to tell me I was playing a dangerous game and that family wars never end well. I told him some wars only start because the people who should have defended you were too busy defending their own comfort. He left without answering. By then, the messages from my parents had shifted tone. Less preaching, more bargaining. They hinted at working something out if I stopped causing division, but never offered specifics. I let the messages pile up unanswered. If they wanted my attention, they were going to have to give me something that mattered, and empty words were worth exactly what they cost. Nothing. And underneath all of it, the plan I hadn't shared with anyone but Rochelle was starting to take shape. A plan that didn't just demand my share of what I was owed, but also forced them into a corner so public they couldn't quietly wriggle out without losing the thing they valued most: control over the story. The shift from quiet hostility to open confrontation happened so quickly it almost felt rehearsed, like they had been waiting for the exact moment to flip the table and see if I would flinch. Rochelle had warned me that once the paperwork for the inheritance was in motion, the gloves would come off. She was right. My phone lit up daily with alternating waves of rage and false sweetness from Deirdre, each message swinging between claims that I was tearing the family apart and sudden offers to talk things through over a nice meal. Warren's contributions were shorter, but heavier, single sentences meant to bruise, like "you'll regret this" or "don't think you're untouchable." One Wednesday evening, I came back from a late run to find an envelope tucked under my windshield wiper. Inside was a photocopy of my grandmother's photo, the one she had framed on the mantel for decades. But across the back in my father's handwriting was the message: she would be ashamed. I stood in the dim parking lot under a broken light, holding that photo, and for the first time in weeks I felt something close to shaking. I wasn't sure if it was anger, grief, or just the weight of knowing they were now weaponizing her memory. I folded it carefully, slid it into my folder of evidence, and promised myself they wouldn't get the satisfaction of seeing me break. 2 days later, I stopped at a coffee shop to answer some work emails, and Jude walked in with 2 of his friends. He didn't see me at first, too busy telling some loud story that made the group laugh. When his eyes finally landed on me, his smile dropped, and he came over like he was about to perform for an audience. "You really think this is going to end well for you?" he said, low enough that his friends couldn't hear. I told him the only ending I was interested in was the one where I got what was mine. His jaw tightened, and for a second, I thought he might actually throw the coffee in his hand. Instead, he leaned in closer and muttered, "If Mom and Dad go down, I'm taking you with them." He walked out before I could reply, leaving the door swinging in his wake. That night, Rochelle called, saying she'd intercepted a conversation between Deirdre and Warren where they discussed changing the locks at the casita before I could make trouble there. The idea that they thought I'd break in was absurd, but it also showed how far into paranoia they had slipped. I told her to keep listening, keep gathering. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about pulling back the curtain entirely. A week later, the tension cracked in public. Warren showed up at the grocery store while I was in the checkout line. He stood behind me, close enough that I could feel the heat off him, and when I turned, he said, "You think the family is on your side now, but wait until they realize what kind of person you are." His voice was loud enough that the cashier froze mid-scan. I didn't raise my voice, but I made sure every word carried. "They already know what kind of person I am, because I don't lie to them." He flinched, and for once, he had no quick retort. He left without buying anything, and the cashier handed me my receipt with a look that said she'd just watched something she would remember. That encounter lit something in me. I started reaching out to every relative who had ever hinted at feeling pushed aside by my parents. One by one, they started talking about loans never repaid, promises quietly withdrawn, and years of quiet manipulation. Each story was another crack in the facade, another thread I could pull when the time was right. Rochelle and I compiled it all, not for gossip, but for leverage. If my parents wanted to drag this fight into the open, I was going to make sure the open air burned. The final straw before the breaking point came on a Saturday afternoon. I returned to my car to find someone had keyed a single word into the driver's side door: "Traitor." The paint curled around the letters, bright silver beneath the dark blue, and my stomach told me exactly who was behind it. I didn't bother calling the police. There was no proof, and I didn't want them thinking I was rattled. Instead, I took photos from every angle, added them to the evidence folder, and sent a single message to my parents. "You're wasting your time." No reply came, but I imagined the silence wasn't peace, it was planning. I could feel the next confrontation coming, like static before a storm. The only question now was whether they would make their move in private, where they could twist the story, or in front of the very people whose approval they'd been clinging to for years. Either way, I wasn't planning to just react. I was ready to set the stage myself, and this time, the performance wouldn't be theirs to control. The call came on a gray afternoon when the sky looked like it had been scraped down to metal. Deirdre's voice was sugar at first, but I could hear the glass underneath. She wanted to meet, just the three of us, away from cousins, away from Rochelle, away from anyone who might stop them from rewriting the narrative. I agreed, but only on neutral ground. A diner near the freeway where no one cared who you were as long as you ordered something greasy. Warren arrived 10 minutes late, wearing that expression he used before announcing punishments when I was a kid, and Deirdre slid into the booth like she was about to deliver some warm family news. They started with the same script. Family unity, how things had gone too far, how we needed to heal. I let them talk while I stirred coffee I didn't plan to drink, watching their faces shift when they realized I wasn't going to fill the silence with concessions. Then Warren leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, and said, "You think you've cornered us, but you've made enemies you can't see." It wasn't a threat about lawyers or courts. It felt heavier, like he wanted me to wonder about shadows in places I couldn't watch. Deirdre reached for my hand, and I pulled back, telling her I wasn't here for theater. That was when they finally said it out loud. They were out of money. The casita was bleeding them dry, and with the inheritance issue pushing into daylight, they couldn't get loans or keep up appearances. I told them it sounded like a you problem. Warren's knuckles tapped the table in a slow rhythm, and Deirdre's voice dropped to a hiss. "If you don't back down, you'll regret it in ways you can't undo." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was the same line they'd been running my whole life, just with new stage lighting. I stood, dropped a 20 for the untouched coffee, and told them the next time we met, it would be across from a mediator. Rochelle had the papers ready within days, the kind that forced full disclosure of every account, sale, and asset tied to the will. Once they were served, my parents went silent for 2 days, then exploded, calls at midnight, long texts about betrayal, even a voicemail from Jude accusing me of destroying the only home we had left. I didn't respond to any of it. Instead, I kept moving forward, telling myself that stillness was just another form of surrender. The first real crack came from an unexpected source. An uncle I barely spoke to messaged me a photo. It was Warren in the parking lot of a pawn shop, handing over a watch I recognized from his never-selling collection. The timestamp matched the day after they got the legal notice. A few days later, Tessa sent me screenshots from a local Facebook group where Deirdre had listed gently used furniture that had been in the casita. Piece by piece, the life they had curated for public view was being sold off in private. And then, the twist I hadn't planned for. Rochelle called late one night, her voice thin and urgent. She'd discovered a second account, one my parents had never mentioned, where part of my share had already been moved years ago. The amount wasn't small, and it wasn't just mine. Jude's portion had been touched too. It meant this fight wasn't only about them denying me. They had been dipping into both shares, hiding it under layers of silence and distraction. When I told Jude, expecting denial or rage, he didn't answer at all. Instead, 2 hours later, I got a single message: "Meet me tomorrow." Alone. We met in a park where the streetlights hummed like insects. He looked different, less smug, more like someone who had been living with a secret that was finally too heavy. He admitted he'd known about the withdrawals for months, but kept quiet because they promised him the casita if he stayed silent. Now that it was being sold, he had nothing left to protect. He handed me a flash drive, saying it had everything: statements, transfers, even emails between our parents discussing how to justify reallocating the funds. Before I could thank him, he walked away without looking back. The next morning, I sent the contents to Rochelle, and within hours she had a lawyer drafting a new motion. This wasn't just an accounting issue anymore. It was misappropriation, maybe worse. My parents would have to explain every dollar in front of people who didn't care about family loyalty or Facebook perfection. When the notice was delivered, Deirdre called me one last time. Her voice was flat. No sugar, no glass. Just a simple, "You've ruined us." I told her I hadn't ruined them. I'd simply stopped them from ruining me. She hung up without another word. I thought that would be the end, but the real ending came a week later in a plain envelope left at my door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 4 words written in my father's hand. "You've made new enemies." No signature, no return address. I stood there in the doorway, the paper softening in my grip, and realized the fight wasn't over. It had just moved into a place where rules didn't exist.